All right, let's look at number 1. We can change tan squared x plus 1 into something. So check your sheet. You can change it to secant squared. So now I got cosine squared x and secant squared x. All right, I know I can change that. Remember the rule, you got to change anything that's not cosine or sine. So I can change that to 1 over cosine squared. Cosines cancel out, answer's 1. All right, that was an easy one. Let's go to number 2. 1 minus cosine squared x over secant squared x minus 1. All right, anytime you got 1 plus something squared or 1 minus something squared, it's probably going to be a formula. I know that one is sine squared. I don't know what that one is. Let me check. Secant squared x minus 1 is tan squared. All right, so I've got sine squared over tangent is sine over cosine. I know that one. Alright, so what's the next step? We do keep, change, flip. So the top is sine squared over 1. The bottom, I flip it. That'll put cosine squared over sine. Sines cancel. Answer's cosine squared. Can everybody see that? Number 3 looks like a really easy problem. Secant changes to 1 over cosine. Tangent changes to sine over cosine. Cosine squared can stay. So I'm just writing it over 1. Cosecant's 1 over sine. Alright, so let's cancel. I can cancel sine with sine. 1 cosine here with 1 cosine there. 1 cosine, everything canceled, answer's 1. Alright, go 4. Tangent squared x plus 1. That changes to secant. So we got secant squared over tangent squared. Alright, I know I got to change secant. That's 1 over cosine squared. Tangent squared is sine over cosine squared. Alright, if I'm going too fast, y'all can just stop and pause the video and start it back when you get ready. Fraction divided by a fraction. Y'all know we got to do keep, change, flip. So I got cosine squared over sine squared. Alright, so these cancel. So our answer is 1 on top over sine squared. Now check your sheet. 1 over sine is cosecant, so 1 over sine squared is cosecant squared. All right, remember, when you're doing the full method, this is the only time I wouldn't change out cosecant into 1 over sine, because why would you want to do full method with a bunch of fractions? I just think it's easier on these. Go ahead and full it out. You got cosecant squared minus cosecant x plus cosecant x minus 1. Now, every full method problem we have, the middle is going to cancel. So you're stuck with cosecant squared x minus 1. Look on my sheet. That equals cotangent squared. Let's keep going. Number 6. I got sine on top over secant minus cosine. Secant, I changed to 1 over cosine. And cosine x, I'm going to write cosine over 1. So, leave sine on top. We got to do the common denominator step on the bottom. When you times these two together on the bottom, you're going to get cosine x. Now remember, I want you to write it here, and I want you to write it here. Alright, these cancel out, and I bring over a 1. Nothing cancels out here. Cosine times cosine is cosine squared. Alright, and I know cosine squared, 1 minus cosine squared will change to sine squared. So now let's do keep, change, flip. I got sine x over 1 on top. I flip the bottom, that's going to put cosine x over sine squared. One sine cancels out there, and one sine cancels out there. So I'm left with cosine over sine, which is the same thing as cotangent. How long's my video so far? 5 minutes, doing good. All right, let's do 7. All right, anytime you got plus or minus in between your fractions, that's just a common denominator problem. So we're going to write sine and cosine both down on the bottom as our common denominator, which means I want y'all to write it here and here. Okay. Now, secant, I need to change that into 1 over cosine. All right, so my sines cancel out. When I times cosine times 1, I get cosine over cosine. Guys, that's just 1 on that one. Over here, cosine cancels. Now, I can't cancel those sines out, but sine times sine is sine squared. All right, check your formula sheet. 1 minus sine squared equals cosine squared. So that changes to cosine squared. So I can cross out 1 cosine on the bottom, 1 cosine on the top. I got cosine over sine. Same answer we had on the last one, right? Cotangent. All right, let's go to 8. Secant squared minus 1's on top. That changes to tan squared. So I got tan squared over secant squared. Have we already done this problem? It seems like we have. Maybe not. All right, so tangent changes to sine squared over cosine squared. Secant changes to 1 over cosine squared, and now you just do keep, change, flip. So that goes on top. Cosines cancel. The only thing I got left is sine squared. 9. 1 plus sine squared. Now, this problem, number 9, y'all look at it. We're going to have to full it out. Now, I know on the last full method, number 5, I said don't change them out. This one you want to change them out. You want to change secant to 1 over cosine, and you want to change tangent to sine over cosine. If you don't, the middle's not going to cancel out. All right, so times by 1, we get 1 over cosine. Times by 1, that's minus sine over cosine. When I times these two, nothing cancels. Sine times 1 gives me sine on top and cosine on bottom. And as you can see, a minus sine over cosine and a plus sine over cosine, those are going to cancel. Sine times sine is sine squared over cosine. All right, now, these are gone. Cosine on the bottom and cosine on the bottom means I already have a common denominator of cosine. We're going to merge the tops into 1 minus sine squared. Look on your formula sheet. That changes into cosine squared. 1 cosine off the bottom, 1 off the top gives me cosine x. Number 10. Cosecant's 1 over sine. That's sine over 1. I think we can distribute this. When you times these two, the sines cancel out, you get 1. When you times these two, sine times sine is sine squared. So that's what I got. Now that's probably a formula since it's got a 1 in it. 1 minus sine squared is cosine squared. Now that was an easy one. Anytime y'all want to see more, just pause it. Go to 11. Secant is 1 over cosine over 1 minus 1 over cosine. This problem looks familiar like we did it yesterday. Cosines cancel. That's going to give me a minus 1 over there. Keep, change, flip here. I know we did this problem yesterday. 1 times 1 is 1 over cosine squared. All right. Now, if 1 over cosine equals secant on your sheet, then 1 over cosine squared equals secant squared. So we can just change that to secant squared. And secant squared minus 1 is tangent squared. So our answer is tangent squared. One over sine minus cosine times cosine over sine. Okay, here's one I don't think we've done. All right, so what do I do first? Do I subtract these two or do I times these two? Everybody should remember that multiply comes first. All right, does anything cross out? Nope. So cosine times cosine is cosine squared over sine. So that's your first step. Second step, can I cross anything out? No, but if it's got a plus or minus in between, you got to do your common denominator step. These already have a common denominator. So you just merge the top into 1 minus cosine squared. That is a formula. That is sine squared. So 1 sine cancels out 1 sine. My answer is sine x. Let's flip it over to 13. All right, cosine plus tangent is cosine squared plus sine squared over cosine squared times cosine squared equals 1. All right, I thought this one would be an easy one for you. You got to times first, and these two cross out. So we're left with cosine squared plus sine squared. Well, it tells you right here, sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. So guys, that equals 1. So I just got 1 equals 1. That's a one-step problem. Go to 14. Tan is sine x over cosine x. Tangent is sine over cosine. Plus cosine over sine equals secant squared. Well, if that's just one word on the right, then we know the left side is going to work out to secant squared. When I distribute these, sine times sine is sine squared over cosine squared. When I times these two, sines cancel and the cosines cancel, so I got 1. All right. Now, I can change sine squared over cosine squared. That's the same thing as tangent squared. So I'm left with tangent squared plus 1, which is secant squared. So you showed me secant squared equals secant squared. That's 14. Let's go to 15. Sine x, 1 minus cosine x equals 1 plus cosine x sine x. All right, remember, you want to cross multiply anytime you got a fraction equals a fraction. Well, when I times these two, I get sine squared. Pretty easy. When I times these two, I'm going to have to FOIL it out. I got 1 minus cosine x and 1 plus cosine x. Alright, so let's bring down sine squared. Let's FOIL this out. 1 times 1 is 1. Hey, we know the middle is going to cancel out anyway. Why don't we just skip it? Minus cosine squared. So 1 minus cosine squared, that changes to sine squared. Then you'll have sine squared equals sine squared. 16. They want you to FOIL out 1 plus sine x, 1 minus sine x. Now 1 over secant, that changes to cosine squared. So I went ahead and changed 16 on the right side, made it into one word. When you FOIL this, I think we did this one yesterday, you get 1 minus sine squared, because the middle terms are going to cancel on FOIL method. All right, look on your formula sheet. 1 minus sine squared equals cosine squared. All right, I'll do another video for the triangles in a second.